What's going on, everyone? It is that time for set 4 where we dive into some tier lists. And the first one we've got is ranking every single legendary and rare on a tier list. Now, I decided to do the combination of the both instead of doing two separate videos with the legendaries and rares because I believe that some of the rares are, well, a lot of the rares actually are better than a lot of the legendaries. And so to me, both of these oftentimes can be the more expensive cards, just in general. And so it only makes sense to go ahead and kind of compare them with each other because there could be, if we were just doing a legendary tier list where some legendaries are in the A and B tier where they're really C's when compared to like some of the rares out there. So we combine the two and we're going to be ranking them, all of them in this video, which as you can see, there are quite a few of them. Now, before we do, a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. And if you want to pick up any of the legendary or rares that we're going to talk about today, I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Let's dive into the tiers first and figure out how we're ranking all these cards. Now, as the card pool has expanded, we're on to set 4 now, which means we've got quite a few cards to compete against. The tiers that are higher up oftentimes shrink because now you have a lot more competition, even with those aspects individually, right? Some of these cards are, heroism, vigilance, or villainy, command, whatever. You have to be in those aspects for the most part, but, well, since there's so many options, the legendaries and rares that probably will be powerful maybe sometimes are omitted. And so that's something to think about as we do more and more of these. But as for S tier for this video, these are going to be the legendary and rares that when I'm building a deck and I have those aspects that that card is a part of, I am almost immediately slotting that in. Like I kind of start with that card. So for example, if you're looking at like Nebula Ignition, if I'm playing a Vigilance deck, I'm like, yeah, I'll probably be playing Nebula Ignition. Just as an example, not that Nebula Ignition will be S tier, I can tell you that right now. But that is one example. There are some situations where the card is just so extremely powerful in one maybe specific archetype within that aspect combination that I will consider to put it in S tier, but we will go over those as they may come by. A tier, this is the highest I will allow a sideboard card to go, since they are by definition not in the main deck. They are a sideboard card. Cards that, maybe have some very niche specific excellent game plans, or cards that are just super, super powerful in one specific archetype. Not to the point where they're game winning like S tier, but to the point where they are core and really make up things that people have to play around. B tier cards, these are honestly the bulk of a lot of your legendaries and rares, as should be since they are the more average tier. But your B tier are decent legendaries and rares. A B tier legendary and rare can easily be an A, or in some cases even higher in terms of other cards like commons and uncommons, just because rares and legendaries usually have a higher power level. And so a B tier legendary and rare usually is part of the core components of a standard deck. So even if it's in B tier, it could still be quite solid. C tier, these are going to be the point where you might want to omit some of those legendaries and rares. They may have some very, very specific situations where you'll include them with the deck, and maybe in one game out of a few, you'll get some value out of it, but definitely not one that you're like, oh my gosh, I have this uncurved, I am sitting very pretty. D tier are the legendary and rares that maybe just are too specific, or they don't really work with Star Wars Unlimited as a card game, right? Like just the game plan that is trying to accomplish doesn't really fit with what Star Wars Unlimited tends to play out to be. With all that said, guys, let's talk about the Vigilance cards first. All right, and we get to start off with Tam Rivora, and I'm probably going to butcher some of these names. I'm just going to completely be honest here at the beginning, but Tam Rivora, we got a 2/5 unit for 3 in Vigilance Villainy. It also has a piloting for 2/2 upgrade, +2/+2 that is, for 2 resources. And on attack, you can give an enemy unit -1/-1 for this phase, at least if they're in the same arena, which is most likely going to be space because pilots generally have space units to go onto. So kind of a mediocre one. 2 resources for +2/+2 in terms of stat line is a little bit below average. So you really want to get advantage out of the on attack trigger. And in some games, you can get a little bit of value here and there, but it still falls to the same prey that a lot of the other pilots do. And unfortunately, you don't get an immediate attack with it. Like, for example, Han Solo pilot. I have found this card to be pretty weak. And not only that, but the fail case of just being a 2/5 for 3 is pretty horrible. One of the real hallmarks of an excellent pilot is the fact that you can play this as a unit and you're not like sad about it. You're like, it's decent. I'm not like begrudgingly playing it. And if I'm playing a 3 resource 2/5, I'm going to be pretty sad. I'm going to be honest, guys. Next up, we've got another pilot in Iden Versio. Now, she's a 4-cost Vigilance Villainy card herself, and we got a 4/3 shielded unit for 4. And we also have piloting. This one, it's 3 cost. You get +3/+3 in terms of stats. And when you do go ahead and upgrade, or rather than when this upgrade attached to unit, which is important for, well, the next card we're going to talk about, we get to put a shield token on that unit. So 3 resources for +3/+3 in terms of pilots is on rate, so that is solid, and it can be oppressive. There are some games where you get this down early, like turn 2, for example, on a vehicle, and you just dominate the game. Like, that has absolutely happened. However, that isn't necessarily a reliable game plan, because that still gets interrupted by waylays, exhausting, defeating the upgrade, etc. Now, this does leave behind the shield token, which is quite nice, even if you defeat Iden, so I do like that. I also like the fact that she is a 4/3 shielded for 4. The 4/3 shielded does end up killing some of the 4 drops and can oftentimes kill some of the earlier plays and stick around as a 4/3. So that's not terrible when you play her, but I don't think she's like exceptional. It's tough for me to rate her right now, but I think I would put her somewhere around low A tier, maybe high B tier in terms of a rare. Just in those decks, specifically Gar Saxon, I find her to be quite amazing. But also, if you're playing a more mid-rangey style, I think Iden can definitely fit in. And I think for those reasons, because she's not like quite an insane option in specific decks, I think I'm going to put her like maybe high-ish B tier as a rare. Next up, we've got Corvus. This is a 5 resource 4/5 restore 2 capital ship, so space unit. And we've got, when played, you may attach a friendly pilot unit or upgrade it to this unit. So obviously the synergy is with Iden. You play Iden as a unit, and then you immediately curve into the Corvus, and then you get to go ahead and put Iden on Corvus, which makes it a 7/8 shielded unit. And that's got Restore 2, which is pretty sweet. Now, as a baseline card, not just with Iden, but if you are playing Corvus, you're probably playing Iden, so that's something to consider. But let's just say you're looking at a 5 resource 4/5 restore 2. Let's say you don't get the when played effect. It's a pretty mediocre card. That probably earns like a low C tier, maybe even a D tier. But it's a card where like I'll play it. I'm not like excited at all. I'm kind of disappointed that I got a 5 resource 4/5 restore 2 space unit. Like, it's not a horrible stat line. It's just that, as we've seen, even something like a Marauder, which is a 5 resource 4/5 ambushing space unit, that isn't necessarily even good enough. You really want to do something a little bit earlier. And those big expensive space units, it's got to do something crazy. Even though this isn't like crazy expensive, it's still on the more expensive end. So to me, that's kind of negative points to it. However, you're not playing this and not trying to get value out of the when played. One of the things is you can move a bunch of pilots around. Like, let's say you play a pilot on the ground, like for example, Tam Rivora. You play early as a 2/5, kind of unfortunate, but then you go ahead and put her on a Corvus, and suddenly you kind of get that value of the pilot. I think that is a nice situation to be in, but even in those situations, I don't think it's like an exceptional play, because you still have to pay for that pilot. Like, you don't get any resource discounts. You need to set this up, which means you need to play that pilot in the ground arena, which is probably subpar because you've just played your pilot, which is intended for piloting purposes as a ground unit. So unless it's like an Iden, which doesn't die immediately or something like that, you're going to find it's not that great. So to me, this is even weaker than Iden, less use case, but still somewhere around like a mid to low B tier unit. Next up, we've got Annihilator. Now, this is an expensive one. Annihilator, 11 cost space unit in Vigilance Villainy. It is a 12 vehicle capital ship. When played and when defeated, you may defeat an enemy unit. If you do, you get to basically go through their entire deck and their hand to find those units and put them in the discard pile, which is a very interesting ability. Now, to me, I've tried this in some control decks. I've tried it in like Bosk Blue, for example, as like the quintessential control deck. I've also tried in like Kira Green, Chronic Green. This card is a little bit too expensive for those decks. You really need to play a deck that's going to be ramping a lot. Palpatine Blue and Piet Blue are the two decks where I've played Annihilator and I've had reasonable success with. And even between those two, I think it's really just Piet that you can be playing Annihilator in. And I think it's decent in there. It's not amazing, but it's just decent. And so for that reason, I actually have to put Annihilator even below Corvus because I don't think it's quite good enough even in that niche spot with Piet, because you'd rather oftentimes just be playing Avenger. But in specific spots, especially in like other control decks and stuff, you can potentially remove all their win conditions very quickly because you'll kill something. It's probably going to get defeated. So if they have another unit out, you can remove all those things from your opponent's deck. It's also kind of nice in longer matchups, especially when like your opponent's playing like Darth Vader, or Luke Skywalker, or Home Ones or whatever, to where you can just completely remove all those cards from their deck and you don't have to worry about that, which is interesting. But overall, not exceptional of a card. Okay, it's not like amazing. It's just okay. And then in those specific spots, it gets a good amount better, like Piet, for example. But next up, and the last Vigilance Villainy card, we got No Glory, Only Results. This is a 5-resource event. It's basically a Vanquish, but with one exception. It's a Vigilance Villainy card. We take control of a non-leader unit, then defeat it. So it can kill basically any unit in the game. And that is really, really awesome. And it goes even further, right? It goes even further. And the reason I say that is because it gets around things like TIE Phantom. And it gets around things like Chewbacca. Now, this is really important in a meta that is playing a lot of TIE Phantoms and is playing a lot of Chewbaccas, okay? So with those cards, what you'll note is basically it says that they can't be defeated by enemy card abilities. But when you take control of that unit, it's suddenly your unit, and therefore it gets around those cards. And so when you have a control deck and you're going all in on being able to remove your opponent's threats, you really can't be stopped by like a TIE Phantom or a Chewbacca. Because if you are, your whole deck starts to really malfunction. Things like Super Laser Blast, things like, your Power of the Dark Sides, your Merciless Contests, all of them just start to get worse and worse, and you're drawing into dead cards. And that's really, really poor. So to me, this is actually an A tier card, just because of that specific scenario. When I'm playing a Vigilance Villainy control deck, I'm almost always, and there were spots in the past where you're playing Vanquish, I'm just replacing those Vanquishes for the No Glory Only Results. And that's specifically because a lot of people are playing Chewbaccas. A lot of people are playing TIE Phantoms. They're still playing Jangos. They're still playing, Cad Banes and things like that. And people have this in their sideboards at the minimum. So at the minimum, I'm dropping maybe a full playset up to a playset between main deck and sideboard because of those cards. This not only deals with things like the TIE Phantom and Chewbacca, but can also just be a Vanquish in those spots where they don't have those cards. And that versatility alongside the ability to counter some of the things that specifically deal with Vigilance Villainy, well, I'm happy about that. Next up, we dive into the heroism cards, and we got Admiral Yularen as our first one up. We got a 1/5 for 3. We got Heroism Vigilance. He is a Republic official, and when played, you get to choose Grit, Restore 1, Sentinel, Shielded. And then if you choose one of those, all your vehicle units gain that chosen keyword. Really, really fun. Really, really poor. I honestly think this guy should be in the D tier. I don't think there's much to kind of explain about this because I think it's self-explanatory, but a 3-resource 1/5 is way too weak in terms of stat lines. This guy could just get killed oftentimes, but even if he doesn't, you are sacrificing your ability to keep going in those vehicles' direction because you have to spend your second turn playing 3 resources or paying 3 resources for this Yularen so that you don't have more vehicles to actually benefit from this. And even if you do have a bunch of vehicles out, like let's say it's late game and you're playing like a Heroism, Command, Vigilance, and you got Ewing reinforcements, you play vehicles, you get this down, well, suddenly, like, you don't actually go ahead and get that much value. Like, yeah, you can get Restore 1 to stuff, but that's only a couple heal points. Grit, like, you have to have some damage on it and make sure that units don't die. I think the Shielded fact is the only thing that's actually really exciting. But you have to play the vehicle into when you have Lauren, because otherwise they don't just give shielded to your unit, because shielded is a when played effect. So I think that's pretty important. Cassian is the next one up. We get a 3 resource, 3/4 pilot, a ground unit, Vigilance, Heroism. He's got just a 3/4 body, but also you could pilot him, and he's going to gain attached units. On attack, discard a card from the defending player's deck. If that card costs 3 or less, you get to draw a card. Also +1/+3. This is a pilot for 2. Now, 2 resources piloting for +1/+3. That's, again, weak. The 4 stat points is pretty weak. You want 5 stat points, like +2/+3, for example, is what you're looking for. And so that doesn't match up for that. 3 resource, 3/4, not terrible as a unit. It's not great. It's still on the, like, I'm decently sad to play this. Like, it's not actually a decent play on turn 2. And then the on attack trigger. Like, yes, there's going to be a decent amount of 3 or less drops in your opponent's deck. But even if you do get that effect, let's say it was a 3 resource, you pilot it for 2, you get +1/+3, and you draw a single card. Like, let's say that's guaranteed. I don't even know if I would still want to be playing the Cassian. And that's something that's tricky. And for that reason, I'm going to have to put him in the C tier. I've just not been super impressed with Cassian. There are decks where you get to pile this on and your opponent doesn't have an ability to deal with it. You draw maybe 1 to 2 cards and you get +1/+3 and it saves your unit for a little while, which is not terrible, but realistically, most pilots can do that. And some pilots can just do it better. And that's something that you have to think about. Next up, we got L337, 3 cost ground unit, Vigilance, Heroism, 3/3. Now, this is where it gets interesting. This ability is actually on the unit, and if she would be defeated, you can instead attach her as the pilot effect onto a friendly vehicle unit. And of course, they have to have no pilots on it. And pilots for 3 resources for +3/+3. So 3 resource +3/+3 pilot, obviously on the weaker side, because there's no ability attached to it. Obviously, the stats are good, but almost every other pilot for 3 also comes with some ability. L3 really is about playing her as a unit. You attack her, attack in with her, and then she moves over to a vehicle and you get some value there. Not bad, right? The problem is that she's a 3/3. If she was like a 4/3, I would be like, oh, maybe we have something there. But a 3/3 just dies to almost every 3 drop in the game, and their 3 drop lives. That's a huge negative. So even though you can play L3, they kill her, and then she moves over to a vehicle unit, you have to have a vehicle unit. And you have to have a situation where, well, you play the L3, and before she dies, that vehicle has to be on the board. And you're still paying 3 for a 3/3, and your opponent could have killed the vehicle beforehand and then kill your L3. And there's like so many different situations where this goes poorly. If your vehicle's gone, you have a 3/3 for 3. Even if you do get the situation where she dies, you move her over to a vehicle, would you rather have just played your pilot on that vehicle initially? Probably. And so maybe just piloting for +3/+3, but you could do that oftentimes with a better pilot in your color combinations. And so for me, L3, also a C tier pilot. Next up, we've got Phantom 2. This is a 3 cost space unit in Heroism Vigilance. It's a 3/3. It's got grit. It's got interesting ability to attach to a ghost. Now, it's any ghost because we have 2 ghosts right now, 2 ghosts. And therefore, you can attach it to that one or the old one. The old one is pretty bad, so I don't think that's what people are going to be playing, but you never know. You never know. And so we have Phantom 2 gives +3/+3 and gains grit to the ghost. Now, a 3 resource, 3/3 with the grit, not that good. There are some situations where you can put a pilot on this and it goes kind of crazy, but still dies or gets really messed up by waylays and things like that, which is very common, guys. It's very, very common for that to happen. It's not like a pie in the sky type situation. A 3/3 for grit baseline, not good enough. It will just die to turn 2 space units, and in a lot of cases, turn 1 space units. You just paid an extra resource just to trade, which is usually not a great thing to be doing. And then the action is a little bit too late in the game because Ghost is just a little bit too expensive. So something to think about there. I think this is not like a terrible play. I think you can still get a little bit of value. Again, there is that situation where you do get a pilot on it and you go to down, you kill their unit. It becomes like, let's just say you play like a Hera on it, right? And it gets a +2/+3, I believe is Hera's stat line. and then you go ahead and you have a 5/6 and you kill like a 3/3, you suddenly become a 8/3. That's a lot of power, and that can sometimes mess people up. So I think it's like a low B tier, maybe high C tier card. Next up, we've got the Ghost. This is a 5-cost heroism vigilance card. We have a space unit that's a 5/6, and it says each other friendly Spectre unit gains this unit's keywords, and if it's upgraded, it gains Sentinel. So it's kind of interesting because if you're able to upgrade it, it just passes Sentinel on to every other unit. It does have actually a really solid body for 5 resources. We talked about Corvus being a 4/5 and how that's kind of like decent. It's not amazing, but it's not terrible. The Ghost being a 5/6 is 2 full stat points above it. So that's already working in its favor. And I have seen this do some work in like the new Hera decks out there, where you're playing out the Ghost and your whole team gets Sentinel. Like you have some sort of Spectre unit in the ground and in the space. And this is a 5/6 Sentinel if you're able to upgrade it, which is not bad. And it also works with like Hera as your leader because you get to put an experience token on the Ghost. So it can do some cool things like that. I will say spreading around keywords isn't all that relevant. Usually you're not going to have a ton of keywords on the Ghost. Now, of course, if you attach like Phantom to the Ghost, then everything gets Sentinel and Grit, which is kind of cool. But again, really, Sentinel being passed around is common, but outside of that, everything else is not really that common. I think this card's okay. I think it's one of the cards that can be a little bit scary in those decks where you are going all in on those Spectre units and Hera specifically. Again, just a solid stat line, and it can be obnoxious to deal with a bunch of Sentinels if you're not ready for it. Next up, we've got the double vigilance card, and the only one. It is Hondo Onaka. This is a 4-resource double vigilance 3/5 shielded unit. We've got on attack, you may take control of a non-pilot upgrade on a unit, and then you get to attach it to a different eligible unit. I'm gonna be honest, guys. I think Hondo's kind of cool. I don't think I can put him like above C or D tier. Here's the issue with this guy, and maybe I'll be wrong, and maybe we can find some double vigilance decks that are really, really solid and play this more curve out mid-range style versus like more controlling options. But the problem is that you're playing double vigilance, and usually double vigilance cards are leaning towards the more controlling style. I think maybe D tier is a little bit too harsh, so I'm going to put him in C tier. But a 3/5 shielded for 4 is just not what you want to be doing in double vigilance. Like, this is the turn you can play vigilance as a card and actually control your opponent's board. It is interesting. I think there is potential for it to be maybe a sideboard option. You don't want to be playing a 4-resource 3/5 shielded. That's just not strong enough in terms of stats. But if you're able to get that on attack trigger and move experience tokens around or some sort of upgrade around, you could do some work. But that just doesn't happen all that often. Next up, we got Corporate Defense Shuttle. It's a 2-resource space unit. It's a 3/5. This unit can't attack. I'm actually going to put this in D tier. I think this is something that's interesting. It is interesting because if you put Sentinel or something on it, it does cool things, right? Because it's the 3/5 Sentinel, and now it blocks space for a little while. Here's the problem. Your opponent can still deal with it, right? Waylay is still a card, which is a very common one. Any removal just goes and kills it. And even in some cases, something like a Trench Run or a Surprise Strike can just fight through it. And yeah, maybe you've traded off 2 for 2, but that's still just a 2 for 2 trade. It's not like it's giving you a massive value. And the important part about this is that you need a secondary card to give this Sentinel. Like, that's really the only situation where this becomes kind of decent. And that any card that needs a second card to be playable, immediate D tier for me. You just cannot be playing a card like Corporate Defense Shuttle and expect it to be good in a majority of your games. It's going to be a card where you're resourcing a majority of your games, and then in that one spot, you're going to do it, and then it's like, okay, that was okay. that's what happens. So I'm gonna put Corporate Defense Shuttle in the D tier. I don't know, maybe someone could break this card, and I'm gonna be laughing at my own self here in a little while. Next up, we've got Close the Shield Gate. This is choose a base. Next time damage will be dealt to it this phase, you get to prevent that damage. This one's kind of interesting because if you look at this card like a repair, where it's heal 3 damage from a base, I think you oftentimes will actually be able to get that value. But your opponent has control over it. So I don't think repair is good enough to be played oftentimes. And so that, to me, immediately, you kind of want to be putting it in like the C tier category, maybe even close to D tier. The other thing, though, that I thought was kind of cool is there is some combinations. Like you can go, the Galactic Ambition plus the Close the Shield Gate to play like a big unit. But again, that's 8 resources to play a big unit, which is probably only like a couple more resources ahead of it. So I don't even think that's necessarily all that relevant. I think I'd rather just play Repair in a lot of situations. So for me, I'm actually going to put this in D tier as well. In the heat of battle is next up. We've got 2-cost event. Each unit gains Sentinel and loses Saboteur for this phase, and it is a Vigilance card. So 2 resource that gives you Vigilance or Sentinel and makes your opponents lose Saboteur, so your Sentinel stays in effect. I think this is just way too weak, right? The decks that are going to be looking at this are going to be more mid-range style of decks, where you have units that can actually be Sentinels. And unfortunately, you're most likely going to have 1 to 2 cards on the battlefield when this comes in, and your opponent probably could just fight through them. Because if you think about it, if you're playing this, right, your units in the prior turn are going to be the units that are getting Sentinel, which means they're going to be a little bit cheaper of units most of the time. Or if you're just playing Vigilance, you're probably already playing Sentinels. So I just don't see this being all that great. Even with the buff where people can't gain Saboteur after the fact, I don't think I could put it higher than I think it's a D tier card. I just don't think this card's good. I would never put this in my deck, like ever. I'm sorry. Next up, we've got Nebula Ignition, the brand new Super Laser Blast in the format. It's a 9 resource event in Vigilance. Defeat each unit that isn't upgraded. It's pretty sweet. It's 1 extra cost than Super Laser Blast, which does matter a lot, to be honest. It does actually matter a lot. So that's a downside going for it. It also isn't just a catch-all, right? If a unit's upgraded, it doesn't kill it. And to me, that downside is too big. It's too big to be able to play this card in the vast majority of decks. To me, this is actually just worse than a lot of the cards in C tier. It's like a low C tier, maybe even unplayable D tier card. I have tried it, and there's just random situations where your opponent's played a wing leader earlier on in the game, or they've played a random pilot, like they're playing Cunning Heroism, and they play Millennium Falcon into Han Solo, and they've got their leader out and maybe another unit out, and you're like Nebula Ignition, and it doesn't do anything, right? Or they've played like Wingman Victor 3, and they've gotten like a pilot on, or like whatever. There's just too many things that this thing does not do anything against. And especially with the new format, I think this is like a C tier unplayable card. But that's Vigilance, guys, and no S tiers yet. Let's dive on into Command. First one up in Command is Pantoran Starship Thief. This one's a really interesting one. We have a 2-cost 2/2 in Command Vigilance. It has, when played, you may pay 3. If you do, you can attach this as an upgrade to a fighter or transport unit without a pilot on it. And then you just control that unit straight up. And then if it ever detaches from a unit, you have to give that unit back. So you take control of a unit. If they defeat the upgrade, then they get that unit back, similar to how Traitorous works. Here's the difference, because I think Traitorous is obviously the most easy comparison. They're both 5 resource, essentially upgrades that take control of a unit. The restrictions for Traitorous is 3 or less cost, which is a big restriction. This one doesn't have that restriction. Its only restriction is that your opponent has to be playing fighters or transports, and they can't have a pilot on it, which does actually restrict it a decent amount with set 4. But to me, this is one of the better cards in Command. This is an A tier one for me. I've played a lot with this, especially in my sideboard, but to me, this is more of a sideboard card, but it is an excellent sideboard card. If your opponent's playing things like Bright Hope, for example, or your opponent's playing things like just random fighters that are expensive units, you can easily take control of those. Heck, you are even able to do something like your opponent's playing Fet's Fire Spray, yoink it, it's now readied up, and you have it. Like, that's the type of thing you can do with Pantoran Starship Thief. And so things like that are exceptionally powerful. And I believe Fet's Fire Spray is a transport, if I'm not mistaken. I'm saying that, but then I'm like, is he a transport? I'm pretty sure it's a transport, which is something that, well, of course, you are really advantaged because now you get a readied up unit, but just in general, just taking control of expensive units, not only removing it from their side of the battlefield, but also gaining it for yours. We've seen how powerful Traitorous can be. Just think about that, but with Pantoran Starship Thief. Now, here's the difference. is if they do go all in on pilots, Traitorous can be good. So I don't think it's actually necessarily better than Traitorous. It's just better in certain circumstances, and Traitorous is better in others. So to me, both of them are really good sideboard options, and it's going to be an A tier card. Next up, we've got Victor Leader. This is a 3-cost space unit, 2/4 Vigilance. Not Vigilance, Command Villainy. It is each other friendly space unit gets +1/+1. Now, this one's interesting. Obviously, in Darth Vader is the immediate thought process for Victor Leader. I don't know if I've really played this card outside of that. You really need a dedicated space deck. And so like Darth Vader is the deck for Victor Leader. To me, this is like a solid B tier. It's a solid B tier. It's not a card where I'm like, you play it in the deck and your opponent sees it and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like over. Because most decks don't have that many space units. And it is a 2/4, which means it does die pretty easily. And it doesn't even trade that well. It doesn't even oftentimes kill turn 1 plays, which can be a downside for Victor Leader. So all of those things have to be considered. But in like a Darth Vader deck, this is a really strong card, especially if you're able to play it when your opponent doesn't have any resources. You pump up all your TIE fighters and you just get in with them. That can be quite a strong option. Next up, we've got Invisible Hand. This is a 6-cost, 6/6 Command Villainy space unit, Separatist vehicle capital ship. When played and when it completes an attack, you may look at the top 8 cards for a droid unit. You get to draw it. But if it is a 2-cost or less, you can play it for free. Now, obviously, this is going to synergize with the Swarming Vulture droids, and we've played that deck. It's actually really good. I'm going to have to play Invisible Hand in the A tier, which might seem a little bit odd because Invisible Hand in of itself is like only good with the droid units, right? It is a 6-cost, 6/6 space unit, which is not is a decent stat line, right? But if you're playing a deck and you have those droid units that you can pull out from your deck, this card in of itself makes those decks scary. That card in of itself makes those decks so much better. And I am really excited to see some more droid units. Now, I think if you're being realistic with this card, the reason why I am putting it into like low A tier right now is because it boosts up that archetype so significantly that it's not even close to viable without Invisible Hand, in my opinion. Now, if you were to look at just like that deck and then this card in that deck and that entire power level, it's probably more of like a middle of the pack B tier card. But just because of how specifically strong Invisible Hand is, it's got to be an A tier. Next up, we've got Executor, 11-cost space unit, guys. Command Villainy, it's a 12/12. It's cool. It's like Annihilator. Same cost. It's got Overwhelm. It creates a bunch of TIE Fighter tokens. It's a D tier. I just don't think this card's good at all. I don't think it's good at all. Like, if I was playing Piet and I had the choice between Annihilator and Executor, I would be playing a full playset of Annihilator before I play Executor. Period. If I was looking for 11-cost unit. The fact that this doesn't do anything when it comes down is just too weak. It doesn't control the board. The TIE Fighter tokens are basically irrelevant. They're basically irrelevant. When you're in this stage of the game where you're playing 11 drops, the 3 damage that you can get from the TIE Fighter tokens is almost irrelevant in every single situation. So Executor, really weak for that reason. Annihilator, it has that when defeated trigger and when played. And the reason why I'm comparing them to is because it's the exact same stat line. The same deck that wants to play Executor or Annihilator is going to be playing Executor if they want to, because these are massively expensive capital ships. You need to have some sort of massive ramp or discount for them. So Piet or Palpatine, but Palpatine would much rather play like a Devastator 10 cost or an Annihilator 11 cost over the Executor. To me, this is a D tier. I just don't see where you're going to be using this one. Next up, we've got Scramble Fighters. This is a 7-cost event. It's create 8 TIE Fighter tokens and ready them. They can't attack bases for this phase. Kind of a fun event. Basically create a TIE Fighter token army and then just bash your opponent's Space Force down. That's the goal here, right? This is pretty weak. And I don't think there's much to be said about this besides this is basically only good if your opponent has space units and you need to deal with them while they're exhausted. That is the only specific situation where I see this being valuable. If your opponent has readied up space units, you're trying to use this to tackle all their units, it's oftentimes too late because your opponent's just going to attack your base and ignore the TIE fighters. Maybe you kill off their units, but that's fine. They got in their damage and it's probably setting them up for a win. But if you're on 7 resources and your opponent's sitting there with a big space force and you're able to use this to maybe knock out 2 small units or maybe one of their big units, it could be okay. But now you're using 7 resources to go ahead and kill 1 unit. Just use a Vanquish or a No Glory Only results. It's going to be far better in more cases. The only situation where that doesn't really compare is, again, if you're having to tackle multiple units. But again, at 7 resources, that's not really the case. If they have multiple units out on the board in space, at that point, it's most likely that you're losing the game. So to me, it's pretty bad, honestly. It's a D tier. It's bad. I almost never play this card. I don't know. Maybe someone else can. You could get a little bit of value out of it, okay? But like, you could technically get a little bit of value out of any of these cards. It's just not applicable in the vast majority of situations. I would just not play this in my deck. Next up, we got Nyan, one of the pilots in the new set. This one's pretty fun. It's a 1 cost unit. It gets a 1/2. You have a 1/2. But then he also gets +1/+0 for each other friendly pilot unit and upgrade. And then it pilots for 1 for +1/+2. And it gets +1/+0 for each other friendly pilot unit and upgrade. So 1 resource for a pilot, usually you want 3 points of stats, so +1/+2 is perfectly on rate. Usually you want it to be a little bit more aggressive, but that's totally fine. And then Nyan just kind of scales throughout the game. I think this is one of those cards where when you're playing like a Millennium Falcon deck, or you're playing like a deck that has a few pilots in it, Nyan really does shine, and it does do some pretty good work. It's very cheap, and it is pretty strong because of that. I think it's actually like a high B tier. Here's the problem with Nyan is that outside of pilot decks, you don't even want to play it. It like has to go in decks that are playing pilots, because if you don't have other pilots, it's a +1/+2 upgrade. And usually you just want +2/+1, which you can get in a lot of the different aspects. And so I'd rather just play that, like Biggs, for example, or Dagger Squadron pilot. Like I'd rather play those over +1/+2. So it needs to go in a pilot deck. And if you are playing a pilot deck, then Nyan comes in and is pretty solid. Next up, we've got Luke Skywalker. This is a 2 cost ground unit in command heroism, but it's got pilot. It's a 3/2 baseline, but then you can pilot for 3, and it gets +3/+2 as the stat line. And if the upgrade would be defeated, you basically turn him into a ground unit. So a 2 cost 3/2 ground unit is okay. It's not exciting. It's kind of mediocre. It's on the weaker side of units you can play on turn 1, right? But it's okay. It's not horrible. So the fail case is meh. But the trick is you almost never want to play this as a pilot. Like, even if you had the option to, and you're like, well, the whole point of this guy is to be played as a pilot. Like, because of his ability on his pilot upgrade, meaning that when you defeat that upgrade, you move him as a ground unit, you want him to be a pilot, because that's the whole value associated with his card. It's not even just because you want to pilot him because he does something cool when you pilot him. You want to pilot him because he'll turn into a ground unit when that unit is defeated. So here's the best part about this. You still get something even if that unit dies. And it can be a little bit annoying to deal with Luke, especially if your opponent's going a lot into the space arena and you've been trying to deal with that by putting your own space units down. And then you just get this like random 3/2 in the ground that can kind of just chunk you a little bit. So it's not terrible. I think it's actually solid. It's one of those cards where I don't think it's one of those ones where you're playing a full 3 of in your deck, but in specific situations, you put this down, you get a nice chunk out of it. Your opponent's going to deal with that unit eventually, you know it. And so you just put this down, and then your opponent also has to deal with the 3/2 space ground unit. I will say one of the hidden value portions of Luke is that he is a force and rebel unit. So force throw is pretty good. Obviously, the rebel synergy is pretty good. So for all those kind of minor things that stack up, I'm going to have to put him in the A tier. I think it's actually a more solid one. I would definitely put it closer to the low side of A tier, but it's definitely a decent upgrade. It's definitely a decent one. It's just kind of annoying. And cards that are annoying for your opponent, well, usually do pretty well. Next up, we've got Snap Wexley. Talk about a pretty mediocre one. We got a 3-cost ground unit in command heroism 2/5. Pretty bad stat line. When played as a unit and on attack, you make it to the next resistance card you play. This phase costs less. And then he's pilots for 2. You search the top 5 cards of your resistance deck and reveal it and draw it for a resistance card, rather. And then you get +2/+2 in terms of upgrade. This card, +2/+2, weak. You get to draw a card, and it's only a resistance card, weak. Okay? You play them as a 2/5, pretty sad, and then you get to reduce some costs of your resistance cards, but you have a 2/5 as the card you play. Like, I'd rather just play a resupply, weak. All those things, he's going to end up in the C tier. I still think he's better than like Nebula Ignition, because Nebula Ignition is just too expensive. But Stat Wexley definitely on the weaker side of things here. Resistance just hasn't really had enough cards to really make me want to play a deck around it. So the effect of that is just a little bit on the weaker side. That's just pretty much what it is. Next up, we've got Radis. This is a 7-cost space unit in Command Heroism. We got a 8/6 resistance vehicle capital ship. And when you control another resistance card, unit, upgrade, or leader, that's really important, it gains Sentinel. And then when it dies, you deal damage equal to its power to an enemy unit. So if you're playing like Holdo, you get an 8/6 Sentinel, right? That's kind of cool. It's kind of cool, right? You're not really going to want to be playing it in any other deck, to be honest, because like Podameron is more of an aggressive deck, so you don't really care to play a 7-cost Sentinel. Holdo is a little bit more value oriented, so maybe you can get some value there. Honestly, an 8/6 Sentinel, we've seen this with like Redemption and things like that. It could be valuable in some situations, but it needs to provide something else. Redemption heals you a ton, and that can be a game changer. This doesn't do that. It only does something when it dies, and oftentimes your opponent can ignore it. Go past it through Saboteur and just hit the ground arena, etc. I don't think it's horrible, but I think it's definitely like a C tier card. It's one of those cards where maybe in a specific deck you can get a little bit of value out of it, but again, when I see this card and I compare it to like Ewing Reinforcements, which of course Ewing Reinforcements is one of the best cards in that cost bracket, it just doesn't even look close. Starhawk. I know a lot of people are excited about this one. This is a 9-drop space unit in Heroism Command. It is a 6/9. It's got Ambush. It has, while paying costs, you may pay half as many resources rounded up. It's got the capital ship tag. It's New Republic, and it's a vehicle. I've seen some pretty cool stuff with this. I've seen some people trying to like go ahead and play like they hate that ship and then get a discount on this, paying like 7 resources essentially for the Starhawk, ambushing out, killing something. Honestly, I think this is just too expensive. I think there are some cool things you can do. I don't think it's horrible. I think when you get it out, it does do some work. It does have ambush, which I really like. I think more expensive stuff need to impact the board immediately, and Starhawk does do that to some extent. But by the time you get this down, you better be in a high value long game match. Because if you're not, if you're against like Sabine, for example, or like some of the pilot decks that are really aggressive, this thing is just too expensive and you're almost never getting this down, because the decks that are trying to ramp into big capital ships aren't Heroism. Like Payette's not going to be playing Starhawk. That's just not going to happen. It's reducing or it's negating that discount that you're getting. So the decks that I think could have played this, it's the wrong aspect for. So I think it's more of like, I think it's better than Radis actually, but I think it's kind of in that stage where I think it's more of like a C tier, maybe low B tier card. Next up, we've got Unity of Purpose. This one's an interesting one, not a card that I think is going to be all that great. It's a 6-cost event, double command. For each friendly unit with a different name, give each unit you control +1/+1 for this phase. So essentially, you got 3 units on the board. All your units get +3/+3. Kind of cool, right? But weak. We've seen these like temporary power buffs on a lot of cards, like Attack Pattern Delta, for example. And to be honest, like they just don't do anything. Like you need to have a big board already for those to be something that actually does anything. And then you need your opponent not to interact with them after you play this card. And then you need to get in attacks with every single one of them. And this is something with like 3 units on the board. Because if you don't have 3 units on the board, guess what? Let's see, you have 2 +2/+2. That's not good at all. And +3/+3 for each unit, like that's 9 additional damage. Are you able to play something else for 6 resources that could potentially just give you a more consistent win? Probably. For me, this is like a D tier option. I think this is like on the same, I think it's literally on the same level, like in the heat of battle, where they're both the same type of effect where you get this bonus big on that one turn, or you're trying to synergize with that specific bonus on that turn, and it's just too weak. Next up, we've got Seasoned Fleet Admiral. This is a 1/4 for 2 resources in command. It's a ground unit. It's got raid 1, so it actually attacks for 2. It does have the rebel tag, and when an opponent draws 1 or more cards during the action phase, you may give an experience token to a unit. I think this is actually kind of interesting. I think this is more of a sideboard card. In my experience, I've actually had a little bit of value out of this guy. I think it's like a B tier card. I don't think it's like insane by any means, but I think if you put it in the sideboard, like a couple copies, and you do end up in a more value-oriented deck, like you say, find yourself against like Han Blue or like an odd Han where you're drawing a couple cards, or you're finding up against Palpatine or something like that where they do draw cards, this could be really, really obnoxious because you can put the experience token on any unit. So you can put it on itself. And that's really important because it self-enables, right? You can put it on other units, which means you spread the value across the battlefield. Like you play this turn 1, turn 2, you play another unit. Your opponent plays something, they end up drawing a card or whatever. Suddenly, you're getting extra value. And it's a 2-power baseline attacker, which is pretty good. And it synergizes with all the rebel synergies, which can be good as well. So I think this is more of like an interesting sideboard option, but not necessarily insane. Next up, we've got General Draven. It's a 2/5 for 5 in command ground unit. When played and on attack, you create an X-Wing token. One of the early cards we saw. So 5 resource 2/5 is obviously horrible. You're looking at like a 6/6 is like a really good stat line. Even like a 5/6 is something that's like decent. But a 2/5 is like atrocious. So the way this works is you need value out of the X-Wing token. And when you play it, you do get a guaranteed X-Wing token. You get an attack in with it, you get a second X-Wing token. The problem I have is that the going wide strategy in this game usually is just not a good strategy. Being able to create a bunch of little different bodies, your opponent just ends up being able to kill them off slowly but surely and find yourself in a bad spot. And that's what I found with General Draven. I've tried to like ECL him out, but the problem is that he's a 2/5 being ECL'd out. If it was like a 4/5 for 5 with this effect, I would be much more interested in him because that's something that can actually kill a unit with ECL. So now you get to ECL this guy out. He ends up being like a 4/5. He kills an opponent unit, and he sticks around as like a 4/1, and you create 2 X-Wing tokens. The problem is him being just a 2/5 body baseline is just way too weak. Almost everything kills it in the ground arena. Next up, we've got Eject. Very specific card. 2-cost event in command. Detach a pilot upgrade, move it to the ground arena as a unit, and draw a card and exhaust it. So this card is a card that I have really not seen any deck play besides Poe Dameron. Poe Dameron is the one spot where I've seen Eject. I've tried to play it in like standard rebel heroism, command, aggression, aggro decks where I'm playing Chewbacca. That's another one that oftentimes lives. The problem with that is like if you're ejecting something after you've already put a pilot on it, chances are that space unit's going to die. The exception is Poe Dameron because you've put a pilot on it and it's so cheap that you get a big unit out of it, which is great. But the other pilots usually are being put on units, and that unit you trade in with another unit or attack another unit, and you aren't really just kind of like completely racing them. The eject does replace itself, which isn't too bad. But I honestly don't see myself putting it in many other decks. I don't think it's a terrible card. I do think it is specifically decent in Poe Dameron. And for that reason, I'm going to have to put it in like middle of the pack C tier. It is specific niche combo with Poe Dameron. I don't think that Poe Dameron combo is like insane. It's just a strong combo. But I don't even think Poe Dameron is necessarily going to be like a meta deck. But maybe I'll be wrong. And then Eject in of itself is just good enough because of that specific combination. Next up, we've got Lightspeed Assault. This is a 2-cost event. In command, you defeat a friendly space unit and deal damage equal to its power to an enemy space unit. If you do, you deal indirect damage equal to the enemy unit's power to its controller. So the idea here is maybe you get a unit low and then you defeat one of your own units, you finish off their unit, and then hopefully that unit has a lot of power, so you get a bunch of indirect damage going everywhere. The problem I see with this is that there's just way too many things that needs to happen. Let's say you're playing an aggro deck, okay? And your opponent's playing like the boss blue, and they get down this big unit. They get down like an Avenger, they kill your unit. You've got Lightspeed Assault. You go through, you Lightspeed Assault your random like A-Wing, for example. You hit their Avenger for 1, and then they have to deal 8 indirect damage across their board. They're just going to put it all in that unit, right? So late game, it's not really going to actually deal all that much indirect damage. Let's say in the mid game, you shrunk a unit by attacking it, and then you use this to finish it off. But now you're defeating a second unit, because if you are attacking a unit to get some HP off of it, chances are your unit's probably dying because your unit's too small. So this just requires too many resources for me to see a lot of value in it. I think there's potential with this card. I'm just not sure I've seen it yet. So I'm going to put Lightspeed Assault probably like closer to the end of C tier. Next up, we've got Turbo Laser Salvo. This one has been pretty solid. Every single time I played with it, I feel like on camera, I just haven't really seen the great effects of it. But every single time I play off camera, I've been able to do some cool stuff. This one, 7 cost event. You choose an arena. A friendly space unit deals damage equal to its power to each enemy unit in that arena. 2 things with this. 1, it's basically a board wipe in the situations that you're going to be using it, because you're going to have a big space unit and be able to wipe your opponent's board. 2, doesn't kill your own units. That's really important. So one of the big decks with this, like Piet, you play your Devastator or whatnot. You play Piet green. You got Turbo Laser Salvo, right? But I shouldn't say you play Piet green. You're playing Piet, and it is green. Therefore, you play Turbo Laser Salvo. So you can play this in Piet blue, Piet red, etc. There's also a couple other decks that I found it to be interesting in, more controlling decks. Again, like Kira Green and Krennic Green have tried out Turbo Laser Salvo, and it's actually pretty good there as well. Because you could play things that aren't necessarily just like Avengers and wipe your opponent's board, but also just other space units, right? If you get down like a reasonably decent sized space unit, you can do a ton of damage, especially with like a Kira, where your opponent's got a couple ground units. You've got, let's say, just an Inferno 4. Or let's just say an Inferno 4. You flip Kira, you do some damage to the units, and you finish it off with like a 2 damage hit to everyone. And that's not insane, right? But it still has a little bit of value in some of these situations. Now, do I think that card is good enough? Like, do I think doing it in that spot is like an A tier card? I think it's like a low A tier card, maybe a high B tier card, but the effect of it is so powerful, I'm willing to go ahead and stretch it to the A tier for now. And that's the last command card we've got. But now we got to move on to our aggression cards. And I'll be honest, guys, the aggression cards, there's some good ones in this. And starting off our aggression list, we've got Allegiant General Pride. This was a pretty fun one. 2 cost aggression villainy. Oh my gosh, these aspects, guys. 2/3 first order. Anytime indirect damage is dealt to a unit, you can defeat a non-unique upgrade. On attack, you can deal 2 indirect damage to a player if you have the initiative. So honestly, I was pretty excited about this guy. Here's the thing with indirect damage is a lot of them are space-based decks. Like if I'm looking at like Boba Fett, for example, that's generally like a space-based deck. And so the problem with playing like a 2-drop 2/3 is that it inadvertently kind of negates one of the advantages with really focusing in on spaces. Well, you have a ground unit, and that can be a little bit, well, of a downside. It is nice if you have initiative to get that indirect damage start piling in. He can do a lot, so that is a nice bonus. Another note, if you don't have the initiative, he's a 2-resource 2/3 most of the time, and he just dies before you actually get that trigger of maybe defeating some upgrades. Not saying that he's terrible, but I've been pretty kind of he's like an okay card. Nothing too crazy. I think he's kind of like a low B tier unit. Next up, we've got, a fun one. And I know some people are going to love this one. We got IG-2000. Quite an insane addition to the pool. A 4-cost space unit in aggression villainy. It is a 3/4 with overwhelm. But when you play the unit, you get to deal 1 damage to each of up to 3 units. Now, this is one of those cards where in your average deck, something that's playing like a space-based deck, or maybe you're not even playing a space-based deck, and you're just playing IG-2000 for a little bit of value. Okay, you deal a couple damage, not too bad. You get a 3/4 body, on the weaker side, probably don't finish anything off. It's kind of just like average to below average. But here's where it starts to get a little bit crazy. in indirect damage decks, or more specifically, in Django Fett. So indirect damage decks, obviously, you're dealing indirect damage, and so oftentimes your opponent's units are going to kind of be essentially additional life bars for their base, because that indirect damage is going to them. IG-2000 can kind of deal damage to your opponent's base by preventing that indirect damage from dishing out to those units, or in the best case scenario, finishing off units. In Django, this is where this card gets pretty good. And honestly, just for those couple of reasons, I'm gonna have to drop him somewhere in the A tier. IG-2000 coming in with Django, obviously synergizes with Tarkin Town, synergizes with all the other kind of random indirect damage you're dealing. Well, I say indirect damage, not as a mechanic, but like in as ISB agents coming down, or P-38s. This can actually finish off a lot of units. And also, when Django is on the battlefield, and even when not, but when Django is on the battlefield, you could potentially exhaust 3 different units on your opposing side of the battlefield. If Django's not down, like he's just in the leader slot, not as a unit, you get to exhaust 1 unit and deal a ping to the other. So really quite obnoxious to deal with. And that is something that I honestly, I've been playing like 2 to 3 copies of this guy in Django, and he is a really, or IG-2000 is a really nice addition to that deck. So I do think it's got a place there. Next up, we've got IG-88. This one's an interesting one. We got a 5 resource, 4/5, but can get +3/+0 as a ground unit if an enemy unit is damaged. This is aggression villainy. And then we've got piloting for 2 resources, and it gives the, well, upgrade as +0/+3. But if there's an enemy unit that's damaged, it gets +3/+0. So +0/+3 for 2 as a baseline, and then it could potentially be +3/+3, just standard. Interesting. Honestly, been very unimpressed with this card. Yes, you can have a 5 resource 7/5, which is very aggressive. But realistically, you get the damage unit effect maybe half the time. And if you are doing that, then playing this like big, beefy ground unit usually just dies. Especially when you're playing a deck that is reinforcing the pilots, because you're going to have a lot of space units, right? Same kind of problem we've talked about in other cards. And then if you're playing this as an upgrade, well, it can sometimes do a lot of work, but oftentimes the 2 resources is a little bit of an odd portion of the curve. If you're looking to just put on 2 resources to get in a ton of damage, well, there are better options in other pilots, I've found. And that's where IG-88 is kind of mediocre to me. There are other pilots that do something a little bit more impressive rather than just give stats, because that's all IG-88 is doing. And so for those reasons, I'm actually going to drop IG in somewhere around like the weak pilot tier, with like Tyvar or Tam, and then Cassian. Both those are like similar feel, where these pilots, yes, they do something, either they're weak stats or they're only stats. It's just not really the ideal pilot. On another note, we've got Darth Vader next, which is another pilot. This one's a 6 resource aggression villainy unit, and it does have a 7/7 body. So pretty nice in terms of 6 resources as a baseline. Then we pilot for 3 for +3/+3, and on attack, you may deal 1 damage to a unit. If a unit is defeated this way, you may deal another damage to a unit or a base. So really interesting. Realistically, this is an amazing Tarkin Town enabler. And I've seen games where you go turn 1 unit, turn 2, you got the initiative, you just drop a Darth Vader, and you start going to town. This also works really well with those damage decks where you're just casually dealing a couple damage here, a couple damage there to random units. Darth Vader fits perfectly, especially if you are playing decks with Tarkin Town, as I said, or if you're playing like the IG-2000 deck. You drop this, you maybe finish off a unit with Darth Vader, and then you get another damage ping, which can be really, really awesome. It's also the unit itself. Remember, this upgrade says attach unit gains on attack, which means that you are able to go ahead and deal a couple of damage and really do some work, especially if that combos with some other on attack triggers. So really interesting Darth Vader. I've seen this do some massive work. It's one of the better pilots in the villainy side of things. I think heroism on average has better pilots, but I do think Darth Vader is one that has really blown me out of the water. I don't think it's absolutely absurd, but the fail case being a 7/7 and the fact that you get a 3 resource pilot, this is worth trying. It's definitely on the low A tier side of things, or maybe even high B tier. But definitely a pilot that's just a lot of stats. It's kind of difficult to deal with, and it's got a good effect when it comes down. And next up, we've got one of the more favorite cards, guys. We've got Devastator. This one is a doozy. It's an 8-cost space unit in Aggression Villainy. We have a 9/6. You are able to assign all indirect damage you deal to opponents. So now you get to choose where it goes rather than your opponent. And when you play it, you get to deal 4 indirect damage to an opponent, which basically, to each opponent, by the way, which basically means you deal 4 damage as you choose amongst their base and or units. This is an S tier. Okay. This is an S tier. And there's a couple of reasons why. Okay. This is an amazing finisher. Amazing finisher. It particularly combos well with another card we'll talk about as we go through some of the other aggression events. But if you just consider this as a unit in of itself, like you're just playing like Bosk Blue or something like that, this is kind of on par, and I compared it to like Emperor Palpatine. Emperor Palpatine was a card that a lot of decks were playing. It was a 6/6 ground unit for 8 resources. You got to deal 6 damage as you choose, which is a little bit more and can sometimes be a little bit more effective. But in this case, you get a space unit, a little bit more damage. So already just baseline, it's a pretty interesting unit. But if that was just the case, this would not be S tier. The reason why it's an S tier is because of the synergies and the absolute game-winning potential of this card in certain decks. Piet Red is one of them, but more importantly, the triple Dark Raid aggression decks. And again, this does have to do with Django a little bit, because this is a card that I absolutely play in Django. Well, guys, little fun fact. Django got a lot this set, okay? But if we just look at Devastator and we are able to triple Dark Raid, it is now a 6-cost play that immediately is readied up to deal 9 to your opponent, and you get the 4 damage trigger. That is amazing. It is an absolutely amazing finisher and can absolutely swing games one way or another when this thing comes down. Of course, it's got the synergy with indirect damage, and that does come into play in some decks. But mainly, Devastator as a card individually is just a solid piece, and then it really has some amazing synergies with Triple Dark Raid, and that goes into like any really aggression villainy deck. Most of them are playing Cunning alongside that. If you think like Cad Bane Red, Devastator can sometimes be in there, and I've seen decks transition over Triple Dark Raid just because of Devastator over, like now there are 2 of them. Django Red's another one, like Von Reg Yellow is another one. All those decks, Devastator is a key component. And again, just playing this as an 8-drop is oftentimes good enough to win the game. And the key part of about this is not only do you get to triple Dark Raid, you get this big space unit, you get to deal some damage, but you can also just go all to the base with this. So this is responsible for potentially dealing 13 damage in a single trigger of triple Dark Raid, or comes down, kills some units, sticks around as a 9/6, you gotta deal with it. It's a game finisher. This thing is absolutely amazing. But next up, we've got Black 1. This is a 2-cost space unit in Aggression Heroism. It's a 2/3. Doesn't have the rebel tag, it's got resistance tag. When it's upgraded, it's +1/+0. And on attack, if you control Poe Dameron, unit leader upgrade, you get to deal 1 damage to a unit. This is decent. It's not amazing, but it is decent. I think in a lot of the aggression heroism decks, Black 1 is kind of a key component. And I also think in some of them, this card is one of the cards that makes a lot of those decks viable. Just having another space unit that's pretty decent and kind of synergies with the pilots is quite nice. So I do think this is kind of a core component of those. I think one of the biggest thing that's really preventing it, if this was a rebel, I could see this being an S tier card, right? If you just think about this, you can go Black 1 turn 1, into turn 2, you go like Wing Leader, and suddenly you've got a 5/5 space unit. It's almost like a battlefield marine. That is incredible. The fact that it's a resistance card means that it doesn't work with a lot of those rebel synergies, and that can be a little bit devastating. Especially since the aggression heroism decks, you can either go that rebel path with fleet lieutenants and do that mix with like K2SO and all that good stuff, Wing Leader, rebel assault, all that type of stuff as we are all used to. But in Black 1's case, well, I usually really want my early drops to be rebels, so I don't do that. Instead, it's more of a piloting card. So that can be advantageous and disadvantageous in other situations. I do think this is worthy of like an A tier. I think it's actually a little bit better. It's interesting because this is one of those cards where it's a little bit unassuming, but just having a 2-resource 2/3 aggression heroism that synergizes with what you're trying to do is good enough in a lot of situations to get a little bit of value and to be one of those cards that people play very, very often. And for that reason, I think it's going to be an A tier for me. Tactical Heavy Bomber is next up. This is a 5 resource space unit. We got a 3/5 resistance vehicle, transport and aggression heroism. It's got on attack, you deal indirect damage equal to its power to the defending player. If a base is damaged this way, you get to draw a card. Honestly, that last section of drawing a card really doesn't matter a lot to me. However, the indirect damage can be massive. This thing gets out of control very quickly. I have played Tactical Heavy Bomber in a lot of different decks recently. In decks that are able to maybe cheat some costs or put out an immediately readied up ship, both those situations, I think Tactical Heavy Bomber do have a place. Because one of the big things with this is there's a lot of pilots that work with this. And if you're playing like yellow, or even if you're playing aggression, you're able to go ahead and use things like heroic sacrifice or surprise strike to artificially pump the power temporarily. So you get in a surprise strike, suddenly it's a 6 powered attacker, and now your opponent has to divvy up 6 indirect damage to their units and base. And most of the time that can be insurmountable. I think there was a couple times where I was playing Tactical Heavy Bomber and I was able to cheat on cost, get it down early, and then do something like put a pilot on it and get in for 6 to 8 damage pretty consistently for just the attack, and then of course double it up with the indirect damage. This card can do some cool stuff, but at the baseline, it is a 5 resource 3/5 space unit, which is pretty bad and only does something on attack. So I think it's got some specific scenarios in order for it to be good. And for that reason, it's going to be like a high to mid B tier card, at least at the current moment. Maybe if there's a more consistent strategy that's able to go in and capitalize on that, I could see this being a little bit higher. Next up, we've got Profundity. This is a 9-drop space unit in aggression heroism. It's an 8/9. It's got Overwhelm. It is a rebel, which is kind of cool. And it's got when played and when defeated, choose a player. They have to discard a card from their hand. Then if they still have more cards in their hand than you do, they have to discard a second card. This is really interesting. And this is one of those cards where if the formats become more and more mid-range, and if we find ourselves in that type of situation, or your opponents are playing a lot more controlling decks, this card is going to be amazing. I have played some more late game decks, and I found myself up against like Anakin Blues or Ray Reds, and they played a Profundity on me, and I felt like it was disgusting. I was like, I have to kill this, but if I kill it, I lose my entire hand. Like, that's the type of situation it's been. But that's, again, only in those long matchups, because if you're not in a long matchup, like, okay, a 9-drop isn't really going to change your situation. Even if you're able to cheat on cost, it's still expensive, right? Unlike something like I mentioned, cheating on cost with a Tactical Heavy Bomber, that's a 5-drop, right? So you're still able to get it earlier on in the game. Profundity is a 9-drop, so you can reduce this down to like 7 cost or 8 cost, and it's still going to be tough to get a ton of value out of it. And for all of that, I think it's more of like, it's like an Annihilator level card, where in the specific deck and the scenario that it's good in, it's really good in, but outside of that, it's kind of mediocre. So gonna go ahead and put it in the lower end of B tier. Next up, we've got They Hate That Ship, and this one is pretty good, guys. We've got a 1-cost event in aggression heroism. An opponent creates 2 TIE Fighter tokens and readies them. Then you play a vehicle unit from your hand. It costs 2 less. Very interesting. This is one of those cards that can cheat on costs, and it's any vehicle unit. It does not necessarily have to be the space units. To me, this is also an S tier card. Now, it's interesting because it's not like, it's an S tier card in that it can do some ridiculous things, like things that you would never have expected. Obviously, the biggest thing that They Hate That Ship works with is Home 1. The new Cunning Heroism Home 1 that costs 9, I believe. And then, actually, it's right here, guys. We can just go and pull it up. But this card comes down. It's a 9-drop. It's a big ambusher. It comes in. If they have 3 or more space units, it costs 3 less, which means They Hate That Ship creating the 2 TIE Fighter tokens. You drop it down to 6 cost, and then you get a 2 resource discount, essentially, because the event costs 1. So this is a 4-cost, 7/8 ambushing capital ship. And then your opponent has to deal with it, right? But this is also another card where that worked with like Tactical Heavy Bomber, getting that down early. It could also work with Profundity if you want to. Realistically, I've seen some better options for that. But this is a card that can really synergize with a lot of different things out there and can be completely backbreaking in those spots. It's kind of like now there are two of them, but a little bit different in that instead of having to match specific traits, your opponent gets 2 TIE fighters, and the 2 TIE fighters can matter, but not as frequently as you would have hoped. So I think they hit that ship. I think there's an argument where it should be A tier, but I think it's definitely one of the better options and can be extremely powerful here in the new format. Next up, we've got Trench Run. This one's a pretty sweet one as well. This one most commonly seen in like Kazuda, because you can really break it in Kazuda, and I'll go over that in just a moment. But this is a 1-cost event in Aggression Heroism. You attack with a fighter unit. For this attack, gets +4/+0 and gains on attack discard 2 cards from the defending player's deck. Deal unpreventable damage equal to the difference in the discarded cards to this unit. Difference in the discarded cards cost to this unit. So for example, you put this on your Cartel Spacer, or rather your Cartel Turncoat. It's a 2/3. You attack in. It's now hitting for 4. But on attack, you have to discard your opponent's 2 cards. And that means that if those differences, like say they go ahead and discard a 7-drop and a 3-drop, your Cartel Turncoat gets hit for 4 damage, which means you don't actually get in for the +4/+0. So it's a little bit of a risky play, but it pays off. And I'll be honest, I've played a lot with Trench Run, with Kaz and without Kaz, and Trench Run has done some major work. This is, for me, one of the better cards, maybe even top of A tier here. This is one of those cards where it really makes some of those fighter decks extremely scary, because it is the highest amount of power that we've really seen consistently being pumped out with a cheap combat trick. When I say combat trick, I mean like Surprise Strike, Breaking In, Punch It, I think is the card name. Those types of cards. This thing just does some major damage and really can mess up your opponent. And I think what's really pushing me to A tier is not only in most decks, I would play a couple copies of this, and then in certain situations, this would win me the game, but that in Kaz Red, this becomes +4/+0 for a fighter unit, okay? Because he prevents those abilities from attaching to that unit. With the new rules change, those abilities can't be applied afterwards or anything like that. So this thing is just +4/+0 for a fighter unit. Incredible, immediate 3 of, to be honest. It is awesome in that deck. If you're playing a more space-based deck, assuming you can actually get the fighters, which shouldn't be a problem. Next up, we've got Relentless Fire Spray. This one's a pretty fun one. We got a 6-drop double aggression, 4/6 transport. On attack, you get to ready this unit, and you go to only use it once per round. So the idea here is it is truly a Relentless Fire Spray. You play it, it readies up next turn, you get in for 4, it readies up again, you get in for another 4. The goal here, I imagine, is to put some sort of pilot on it. So what happens is you get in for like 8, it readies, you get in for another 8. Basically doubling whatever damage. It kind of has like double strike for those of you that play Magic the Gathering. You get in for an attack, and then you get in for a second damage of that attack. Here's the problem with this. It's a 6-drop, doesn't do anything immediately, and has to wait till next turn. And I think most decks that are playing double aggression are going to have a hard time really taking advantage of this in this stage of the game. Double aggression tends to be a lot more aggressive, and so trying to play this big fat unit, letting it ready up, and then pumping it, and then attacking twice is kind of like a dream scenario, okay? Also, if you're playing, like, let's just compare it to like Fet's Fire Spray, the 5/6, guess what? That immediately readies up, which means you get it to an immediate effect, and you attack for 5. So if you were to put a pilot on that, guess what? You attack for that, and then you attack for next turn. So you really need 2 turns worth of this Relentless Fire Spray to compete with a card like Fet's Fire Spray. Not saying that you really need to, because Fet's Fire Spray is definitely one of the best cards from set 1. But Relentless Fire Spray, it just doesn't do anything for being as expensive when it comes down. And I think that can be a little tricky. All of that said, it's also a double aggression card, and that's something that really matters because you have to be in double aggression, and double aggression is a specific playstyle. Similar to like double vigilance, you need to want to have, or you really want to have a deck that fits that strategy. It's also why we have the Unity of purpose, right? Double command. I think this is also one of those cards where it's pretty mediocre. I think it's like a C tier option. Next up, we've got Shadowcast. This is a 6-drop space unit in aggression. It's a 4/7 underworld vehicle transport. When a friendly unit is defeated, you may use all of its when defeated abilities another time. So basically like a glorified Thrawn ability on a 6-drop 4/7 space unit. This is not good, in my opinion. A 6-drop space unit 4/7 is pretty bad in of itself. Like that stat line is pretty mediocre. Similar to Relentless Fire Spray, guys. I would rather have more power than the 4/7. It's just a little bit too it just doesn't affect the board enough. And then on top of that, it doesn't do anything immediately, just like the Relentless Fire Spray. Everything that we literally just said about the Relentless Fire Spray pretty much applies to the Shadowcaster, except instead of having to attack to get the ability, you need to have something die. Now, I do think that's a little bit easier to do than the Relentless Fire Spray, because you can also have units already on the battlefield, get an attack in with them after you play the Shadowcaster, and then trigger its when defeated abilities again. Here's the problem. Are those when defeated abilities good enough that when you do trigger them, you're actually getting the value of playing this over any other 6-drop that you could be playing? That's the tricky part. And for those reasons, I think it's more of like a high C tier card. I could see it in those Thrawn decks trying to get some extra value, but I'm not a huge fan of it. Next up, we've got Targeting Computer. Pretty straightforward. 1-cost upgrade in aggression. You may assign all indirect damage dealt by this unit, and it gives +1/+1. Very interesting card. It is something that I have tried to get to work. Something like a TIE Bomber can be really good with Targeting Computer. Turn 1, you play the TIE Bomber. Turn 2, you play the Targeting Computer. Suddenly, you're able to deal 3 to any unit you choose, or spread amongst any units that you do choose as you wish. That is pretty excellent. Here's the issue. It only works with very specific cards, right? Cards that are consistently doing indirect damage. And on top of that, it is an upgrade, which means you have to already have that unit, and it's only +1/+1. So I think it's got some really cool, interesting combinations, but I don't think it's all that insane. For those reasons, I'm gonna have to put it probably like low B tier. I actually do think it is interesting, and I do think people should be trying it out more in your indirect damage style of deck. But, well, it's still an upgrade, still just gives +1/+1. Those are negatives, okay? Next up, we've got Hot Shot Maneuver. This one's a 1-cost event in aggression. Choose a friendly unit for each of its on-attack abilities. Deal 2 damage to a different enemy unit, then attack with the chosen unit. So there's 2 things with this card that I really don't like. A, it needs to be an on-attack trigger. So how often are you going to have like 2 to 3? Not very often. And then B, you have to deal 2 damage to a different enemy unit. And that means that this is not going to be able to be stacked all that well. So you don't get any bonuses for dealing that initial attack with Hot Shot Maneuver. So you really need to have multiple on-attack triggers, like 2 at least. Otherwise, this is just a worse Daring Raid for the most part. Like, yes, you can technically attack with it and go ahead and get the 2 damage, but then Daring Raid, it can hit the base, which is oftentimes better. So to me, it needs to be more than just one single on-attack trigger to get some value. And that's just really rare. That's just really, really rare to see. So for me, this is honestly a really low C tier. It's a really low C tier. And lastly, for the aggression, we've got Planetary Bombardment. Definitely a fun one that I think a lot of you have been having fun with the capital ships. Of course, this is the card I was talking about earlier with the Devastator being able to kind of just wham someone for 12 into the base if you want to, or just basically do a big overwhelming barrage. But I don't actually think it's S tier. I think this card is maybe a little overrated just because of how fun it is. I have had some good experiences with it. And if it is in like Piet with Devastator, or you are playing like a lot of capital ships, I do think Planetary Bombardment can be decent. But I think it kind of fits around that like low A tier, high B tier area where you can do some pretty sweet stuff. But I don't think it's a card you should be automatically adding. I think if you're in the specific capital ship deck like Piet Red, or you're playing Devastators or like Ruthless Raiders. Usually if you're playing Devastators, you're also playing Ruthless Raiders. So if you're playing that type of style, Planetary Bombardment can work out for you as a nice finisher. And it also is more interesting depending on the matchup. I played this as a sideboard option against like control, where you're just using this to deal 8 to your opponent's base because they don't have any units in the battlefield. So I've had that situation happen before, and that can be pretty cool as well. So Planetary Bombardment for me, very low A tier, maybe high B tier. The potential on this card is insane, but it's not as universal as you might think. Really, Piet Red is like the key deck for that one. On to Cunning. Starting us off, we've got Rampart. Nice little 2-drop Cunning space unit in Villainy. It's a 3/3. It's got a pretty interesting ability to where it only readies during the regroup phase if you have 4 power or more on this thing. I think this is a really unfortunate way to word this. If this said it cannot attack unless it has 4 or more power, I think this could be an A tier card. If that was the case, because you have to commit at the end, during your previous turn as to whether or not you can attack on the next turn, is just way too much for this card. Obviously, there are a couple decks that can do it a little bit easier. Von Reg is one such deck. Of course, if you are playing other decks that can easily pump things, it can make Rampart a little bit better. Honestly, though, this is one of those cards where I have tried and I have had very little good experience with. I think this is like a D tier card, to be honest. Maybe C tier. You know what? I'm not going to stuff it that bad. I think it is actually a little bit better than some of these stinkers down here. I'm going to put it in C tier. But Rampart, there are just too many things to even make it playable. You know, like if this doesn't ready, this is an unplayable card. So you need to put a pilot on it preemptively before you can even get an attack in. Or you need to do something to pump its power. Or something needs to happen. And that's just too weak for a card. A card that can't attack, guys, is down here. It's down here. 3/5, guys, is down here. Even if this is a 3/3 baseline, mind you, you know what? No. I'm gonna keep it. I'm like trying to convince myself into D tier. But I was gonna say, even if it's a 3/3, like we have 2 3s, right? It's 1 extra power for the downside of not being able to attack. Maybe it is D tier. I don't know. What do you guys think? Rampart D tier? I don't know. Has anyone actually got this thing to do some good work? Next up, we've got Moff Gideon. This is a 4-cost ground unit in Cunning Villainy. It's a 5/4. It says when it deals combat damage to an opponent's base, each unit that they play this phase costs 1 more. So kind of an interesting one, a little bit disruptive for your opponents, but it is a 5/4, which is a little bit squishy. It does have a nice power. I do think the stat line is good. Like, it's a good stat line for a 4-drop, right? I'm happy with that. But I think I generally like 4/5s more than 5/4s. And the main reason for that is 4/5s die to less earlier plays. And that's something that is reasonably relevant. Now 5/4s will still trade, which is good. So it's still solid. So that's not really a big deal. But is this effect that you're getting from Moff Gideon actually good enough? I've seen it be a little bit disruptive in some games where you get an attack, your opponent's prepping for maybe a double unit turn, or maybe they're just going to ECL Podameron or something impressive like that, right? And you drop your Moff Gideon, your opponent has to make the choice of, do I attack with my units now or just take initiative? Especially like with Sabine, for example. I've seen this. I played this against Sabine one time, and it kind of messed up their ECL Poe turn. So I was able to win that game by stalling out Poe for another turn, even though they could still play another unit, like a wing leader, for example, or a battlefield, whatever they want to play on that turn. They aren't able to get their big drops out with Moff Gideon kind of stalling out things. So that's kind of nice. But all that is... it can depend on the game. I don't think it's all that great, but it can be a little bit disruptive. I think it's like a B tier card. I think it's somewhere in like the middle of the pack. Not too bad of a card here. Moff Gideon in the B tier. Next up, we've got Boba Fett. Another Boba Fett. This is the 5-resource ground unit in Cunning Villainy. It's a 5/4 shielded. It's got piloting for 2. It says when you play it as an upgrade, you can deal 1 damage to a unit or 2 if you attached it to a transport, and it gives +2/+3. So decent stat line, +2/+3. It is a 5-resource 5/4 shielded. So a really solid play actually on the ground if you can't do the piloting effect. But oftentimes I'm looking for the piloting effect. I actually have had some really good experience with this card. I've played it a good amount in like Django and Cad Bane. Cad Bane was the other one that I played it in. It is an Underworld card, which is pretty nice, but also just any deck that's kind of doing this damage randomly to opponents' units. This played on a transport, which you will have a lot of. For example, IG-2000 is transport. Your Fett's Fire Sprays transports. Those are all considerations for Boba Fett, and just dropping it on there can oftentimes finish off a unit. And for those reasons, I'm actually going to go ahead and jump it up around the same tier as like Darth Vader. I think it's around this tier where decent pilot effect, can do some valuable things. I will say Darth Vader can run away with the game, whereas Boba Fett can't really. Boba Fett has better chance to just get to this immediate value, which Darth Vader oftentimes will not. That one's more of massive stat stick into a little bit of value later on. Next up, we've got Invincible. This is a pretty sizable unit. It's got a 6 cost space unit in Cunning, Villainy. It's a 6/6 Separatist vehicle capital ship. If you control a unique Separatist card, again, this is a leader included, so Trench, Count Dooku, it'll cost 1 less. And then when you deploy a leader, you may return a non-leader unit that costs 3 or less to its owner's hand. So realistically, this is a 5 resource, 6/6 space unit for the decks that actually want to play it. That's not bad. And then you get to bounce a 3-drop when you deploy your leader. Also, not too bad. I don't think this is like insane or anything like that. It doesn't have, and oftentimes I would play it with the same deck that Invisible Hand is in. But Invincible doesn't have that same like win the game potential. It is a good size unit. Remember, if you're playing a 5-drop 6/6, you've got like Poe Dameron to contend with, or like Anakin Skywalker, or Zuckuss, right? Like those cards are just in general a little bit better. Even if you get the deploy to bounce something, that's great and all. And if you are able to consistently get that, it is to some degree on the level of like a Zuckuss, for example, but that just doesn't happen all the time. And again, that's only applicable in the Separatist-led decks, which is also a big downside, because if you don't have a Separatist leader, then it's very unlikely for you to get that discount. So to me, I think of this and I'm like only in Count Dooku, only in your Wat Tambor X, like only in those types of options. So for that reason, I'm gonna have to put Invincible somewhere in like the lower portion of B tier, mainly because the leaders that can support the Invincible just aren't that great. Kind of a victim of its options. Next up, we've got, oh man, Cat and Mouse. I haven't seen this art in a long time. This was a 3-cost event in Cunning, Villainy. It's got exhaust an enemy unit. If you do, ready a friendly unit in the same arena with power equal to or less than that enemy unit. So kind of interesting. You can go ahead and get a little bit of value here and there by, exhausting their unit. You get to ready up yours, get in a little bit extra damage. Here's the problem with this, and this is a pretty big problem. In order to get maximum value for this, you must attack first. And usually your opponent is going to follow up with attacking themselves. Therefore, the unit you would like to exhaust is probably not the unit that you can exhaust after being able to get full value from this. It's a big downside with Cat and Mouse. Not only that, but honestly, the ability to exhaust enemy units is powerful, but you can do that on No Good To Me Dead with 1 resource less, and it lasts for 2 rounds. To be honest, that in of itself makes Cat and Mouse almost unplayable. Yes, you can do some cooler things with it, but the situations that allows you to do cooler things with Cat and Mouse makes it so that, well, the actual effect of it is not that strong, because the sequence that you have to play out doesn't actually happen all that often with Cat and Mouse. And, well, if it does happen, it'll only happen once oftentimes. I've not gotten this card to really do all that much. And even if I have, it's one of those things where, okay, I prevented them from getting in for 4 damage and I got an extra 2 damage in or something like that. It's not actually that impactful. I would rather have No Good To Me Dead like 10 times out of 10 in my main deck. So for that reason, this one's a bad one. I think it's actually, I really don't think it's playable at all. Next up, we've got Ahsoka Tano, and this one's a pretty solid one. I'm trying to decide if this one's an A tier and S tier one, but we've got a 4-drop ground unit in Cunning Heroism. It's a 3/5 force unit. When played, you have to discard a card from your opponent's hand, and if it's a unit, you can exhaust a unit. So a little bit of tempo advantage, a little bit of hand disruption, and it's a 4-resource 3/5, which isn't horrible, right? A little bit lacking on the power, but still an overall solid body. I've found this to be pretty solid in all the standard decks that you would have expected. Your Hans, your Quinlins, like that type of stuff. I've seen Ahsoka do some pretty nice work. The exhaust is relevant. The hand disruption is relevant. I don't know if I can put it in S tier. I think it's more of an A tier card, honestly. Oh, you know what? We're not going to have a big S tier. I'm going to put it in S tier because it is one of those cards where I feel like when you're in these aspects, Ahsoka should be like a 2 of automatically. It kind of goes with like Kira, for example. You want those 4-drop disruptive elements, especially when you're playing like double Cunning, for example, and you do things like, I'm going to drop in my Bodhi and I get to go ahead and really disrupt my opponent's hand, and then I get to follow that up with some even more disruption to really mess up my opponent. All of that is exactly where I want to be. So Ahsoka S tier. I don't know. Maybe people will disagree with that one. Next up, we've got Han Solo, and this one, we're just gonna drop that one in S tier as well. This is one of those ones where it's kind of like that Hot Shot Blaster. I believe I put Hot Shot Blaster in the S tier for the Shadows of the Galaxy when I did that legendary tier list. Someone will have to correct me if I'm wrong. But Han Solo, absolutely an amazing card, and I do think it's probably one of the best options from set 4. This one, it's a 5 resource ground unit. It's a 4/5 stat line. It's got ambush and it's got piloting for 2. It gives +2/+3 in terms of stats. But here's the key part. When you play this as an upgrade, you can attack with that unit. And if it's the Millennium Falcon, you do like a shoot first. That is amazing. I think the biggest thing is that the fact that you can immediately attack with it. That makes this card playable in of itself and something that I actually want to play in my space decks because it kind of acts like a surprise strike or a breaking in, but it gives me permanent stats, which is excellent. But if you're playing Han, you're going to be playing Millennium Falcon. It just is what it is. It's in the same color combination. You're going to be playing Millennium Falcon. And I can't tell you how many times where I've played Han and you put this on a Millennium Falcon and you knock out an opponent's big unit and they're left with a 5/7 Millennium Falcon that's obnoxious to deal with and it's not taking any damage. It's a 5/7. And even worse, if they have the other Millennium Falcon that gets better with pilots, that's even worse. Okay, because they have now not a 5/7, a 6/7 that can get another pilot like a Chewbacca, and then they are just winning the game. It just is what it is. Han Solo, really excellent. And the fail case of this is a 5 resource 4/5 ambusher. That is excellent as well. I've seen a lot of situations where I'm playing this just as a unit because I'm getting that ambush in because, they're rushing me down in the ground arena, and that's won me games as well. So both of this is probably the best unit side of a pilot so far that we've seen. Maybe in the future it'll be different. And then also one of the better pilot sides. With that combination, it's an S tier. If I'm playing Cunning Heroism, I'm immediately considering Han Solo to be in the deck if I have any sort of space units. And guess what? If I'm playing Cunning Heroism, I'm probably playing Millennium Falcon already because that's another card I immediately consider within the deck. So Han Solo, pretty interesting option there. Home one. This one's a pretty fun one. I know a lot of people love their home one. We talked about this with They Hate That Ship. It's a 9-drop space unit in Cunning Heroism. It's a 7/8 Rebel Vehicle Capital Ship. It's got, if an opponent controls 3 or more space units, it could cost 3 less to play. It's got ambush, right? So it could potentially be a 6-cost 7/8 space unit ambusher, which is really interesting. But here's the problem with that. I've only seen this card actually be viable in decks that have They Hate That Ship because you're not going to get that discount often. You will occasionally, and that's where I think it should be somewhere in like high B tier, maybe low A tier, because I feel, as far as my experience has been, home one is a great sideboard option. If your opponent's going to be playing a bunch of space units and you can kind of guarantee that discount, a 6-cost 7/8 ambusher is good. It's a good card. Kills Fett's Fire Spray, for example. But even then, it's a little bit too late, right? With They Hate That Ship, it comes down on 4 resources, kills your opponent's space unit, and does some crazy stuff, right? That makes it worth it. That specific combination is pretty good. And I guess because of those reasons, I'm going to have to put it probably in the A tier, because I do think that combination of They Hate That Ship and Home One is pretty good. And it is something that I am excited about and does win me games. But it's a specific combination across multiple color combinations. And then even outside of that, I don't think the card's very playable. only as a sideboard option, and even then it's a little bit rare. Talking about sideboard, Jam Communications. This is a 1-cost event in Cunning Heroism. It's a event that allows you to look at an opponent's hand and discard an event from it. Pretty straightforward, an amazing sideboard option. I would not play this card in my main deck. I've seen a few people play it in the main deck, and yes, there are events that float around, but I think it's really one of those cards where you want to be fighting up against decks that are really leaning on their events. For example, I think if you're fighting against Django Red, it is reasonable to bring in Jam Communications to take out their Triple Dark raids for 1 resource. If you're fighting against Control decks, taking away all of their events for 1 resource is pretty impactful. For that, I think it's actually the best sideboard card we have from set 4. Jam Communications is excellent. It fits perfectly with what Cunning Heroism wants to do, and you can really rip apart an opponent's hand, especially if you go like turn 1, like let's say you're playing Double Yellow Han, for example. You go turn 1, play Bodhi, knock out a non-event. Turn 2, you play Spark Rebellion plus Jam Communications. Some of them you've like wiped their whole hand out, right? Like, not saying that's a good play, but the deck in of itself kind of naturally disrupts your opponent's hand. So Jam Communications fits perfectly within that, and it's even cheaper than Spark Rebellion, which is excellent. Next up, we've got It's a Trap, and if an opponent controls more space units than you get to ready each space unit you control, and it is a 3-drop Cunning Heroism event. So here's the problem with this card. In order for this to be good, you need to be playing a lot of space units. If you're playing a lot of space units, then your opponent is unlikely to have more space units than you. It's basically an unplayable card. Honestly, I don't really know how more simple I can get with that. Like, if you're readying up 1 unit, it's not good enough, because there are things like Karugian Turn, for example, that are probably going to just be better baseline, or Bravado, or something like that, right? So you need to be readying up multiple space units, and now you're getting to 2 space units, let's say. Well, now your opponent needs 3 space units in order for you to ready those up. Let's say you are going wide with space units. You got 3 space units. They need 4 space units to do that. It just doesn't happen. This, to me, might be the worst card. It's a D tier for sure. It is really poor. Readying up units already is a little bit of not a great mechanic. And the fact that it's prerequisite based on something that you want to do, and your opponent doing it more than you are. Like, if your opponent has more space units than you, you're probably losing that game in a deck that you really want space units that you can ready them up. I'm just saying. Next up, we've got Sedan Ithano. This one is a 2-cost ground unit in Cunning. It's a 2/2, but you can play it as a upgrade, or rather, when you play it as a unit, you can attach it as an upgrade to a vehicle unit without a pilot unit, and it gives -2/-2. It's kind of like a Perilous Position. This one's not bad. Again, I think of it like a Perilous Position. It can still knock out like TIE Phantoms, for example, which is pretty sweet. It does have that effect on it. It's not as universal as Perilous Position. Perilous Position would be like an A tier. If I were to rate it on a list, looking back on like set 3, for example, I would put A tier, maybe S tier. I don't know if it's S tier. It's probably S tier, to be honest, in that set. This, to me, is significantly weaker. Perilous Position, one of the best parts about it is that it exhausts that unit, so you don't get an attack with it. And this has a restriction of only being able to play it on vehicle units. If you do play it. Obviously, the fail case is a 2-resource 2/2, which is pretty bad. I don't think it's horrible. I don't think it's great. It's somewhere in like the low end of B tier, where I think it's playable. It might be a sideboard option for Cunning decks. Next up, we've got Stolen AT Hauler, a pretty cool one. This is a 3-cost space unit in Cunning. It's a 4/5. It's got when defeated, choose an opponent for this phase. They may play this unit from its owner's discard pile for free. So essentially, huge overstated space unit. But if it dies, your opponent gets to play it and goes to town with it, right? There is a couple of decks that this works really well in. Kazuda Red, Kazuda Yellow are key ones. It's also not bad, I think, when you are controlling the space arena. You just have to play it in a way where you're not just running this out on turn 2 every single time, right? In some matchups, it's amazing. In others, it's horrible. Some matchups, it's a 4/5 beater that just completely ends the game really quickly. In other matchups, it gets hit by Tarkin Town and your opponent gets a 4/5 for free, right? Something like that can be really devastating. So it really depends on the matchup. Obviously, Kazuda gets a 4/5 for 3. It removes the downside, which is really nice. I think this ends up somewhere in the A tier. I think it's actually a pretty solid card. It just is a poor, one of those cards where it has a really high upside and also really low downside. So depending on the deck that you're playing and, of course, the situation, resource it when you have to. Next up, we've got Radiant 7. We got a 7-drop space unit in Cunning. It's a 5/6 Republic vehicle capital ship. Each enemy non-leader unit gets -1/-0 for each damage on it. And when you play it, you deal 5 indirect damage to a player. So 7-drop space unit, 5/6. Horrible. Horrible. You get the 5 indirect damage, sure. And you get the effect of shrinking your opponent's units if they happen to have damage on them, which probably does happen if you have indirect damage. All of these things I am extremely unimpressed with, especially in Cunning. One of the things about Cunning is Cunning decks usually try to end the game around this time or even before it. And so Radiant 7 doesn't really fit in that game plan. Also, if you are getting this 7-drop and you're playing this Radiant 7 to try to go ahead and shrink your opponent's units and all that stuff, there's a good chance that the indirect damage could just be dealt to their base. They don't even get affected by the -1/-0. I just don't really see a place for this one. I am going to have to put it in like low C tier to me. Next up, we've got super heavy ion cannon. This is a 2-drop upgrade in Cunning. It's got +0/+3, so really weak stat line, but you can attach it to a capital ship or transport unit. Attaching it gains on attack, you may exhaust a non-leader unit the defending player controls. If you do, deal indirect damage equal to its power to that player. So essentially, you attack, you get to exhaust a unit, and then you deal, a little bit of indirect damage to their face. It's interesting. It's got an interesting on-attack trigger. It's pretty powerful, to be honest. The problem is that it's an upgrade that needs to attack with that unit to get value. And that can be a little bit tricky. Not only that, but you also need to have a transport or capital ship. More likely than not, it's going to be a transport because capital ships are a little bit more expensive. But transports, well, they're actually not super rare, but can be a little bit tricky to go ahead and get this super heavy ion cannon and then actually start chaining off indirect damage. I think it's okay. I think it's like a C tier. I don't think it's amazing. I think it can be interesting. The problem is that indirect damage, especially when you're doing this exhaust thing and you spent 2 resource +0/+3 is probably just not good enough. It's just not good enough to actually go ahead and really rush down the game. Next up, we've got Jump to Lightspeed. This is a 2-cost event in Cunning. Return a friendly space unit and any number of non-leader upgrades on it to their owner's hand. The next time you play a copy of that unit this phase, you may play it for free. So the idea behind this is you get to bounce one of your units, you get to take all those upgrades and bring them back to your hand, you don't lose them, and then you just get to replay that unit. There's a couple of cool things with this. Obviously, if you've had a pilot on that unit and it took damage and your unit would die if that pilot moved off of it, well, now you can go ahead and just replay it, which is kind of interesting. Also, if your unit would have died, like just in that turn, you can potentially use this as like a full heal on it, which is kind of interesting. It also triggers when played effects again, which can be kind of fun as well. Now, it does say return a friendly space unit. So it has to be a space unit and it has to be a friendly unit, which is kind of, well, can be a little bit unfortunate if you wanted to be a little bit more versatile with this card. It's interesting. I don't think I found a spot for it, really. I'm going to put it in C tier, but on the higher end because I think it's got a little bit of potential, but I'm not exactly sure where to put it yet. And then lastly, in terms of Cunning, we've got Commandeer. And I'm going to be honest, guys, Commandeer, it's insane. It's a good card. It's like maybe number 3 in the entirety of the set. 5-cost event in Cunning. You take control of a non-leader vehicle unit that costs 6 or less without a pilot. If you do, you get to ready it. And at the start of the next regroup phase, you get to bounce it to the owner's hand. So the way this works, your opponent plays any 6-drop or less unit. You get to take it, even if they just played it, ready it, kill their other unit, and then guess what happens to this unit? It gets bounced back to their hand. It is a waylay mixed in with the ability to either rush in damage or use it as a sort of like change of heart where you get to kill your opponent's unit. It is incredible. This is a game changer level card. Honestly, I want to put this as the best card from set 4. In my experience, if your opponent has any vehicles, this can be an insane card. Again, because you get to ready it and it gets bounced, it just makes it so much easier to fit in with the strategies that Cunnings are trying to do. You're trying to be disruptive and you're trying to put on pressure to your opponent. This does both, and it can be game changing. Your opponent plays a Fet's Fire Spray, yoink, it's mine now. Attack, bounce back to your hand. Opponent plays a Ruthless Raider, yoink, it's mine now. Attack, maybe it trades, maybe it dies, get the trigger. Your opponent plays, I don't know, some sort of Sentinel Bright Hope, boom, mine now, attack, get to go out and bounce that Sentinel back to their hand. It just has so many implications for the space units in this set. Honestly, I don't know if I can put it in like the best. I don't know, guys. This S tier, like, I could see all of these cards, all of these first three as like potentially just having some of the best experiences I've had with cards in this set, especially in the rare / legendary category. So really sweet stuff with Commandeer. I mean, there's just so much utility to this card that I am super impressed with it. But then we've got some last additions in Cunning, or in Heroism, Villainy, and Colorless to go over. So starting us off in these last couple of cards, we've got There Is No Escape. It is a 2-cost event in Villainy. Choose up to 3 units there. The units lose all abilities and can't gain abilities for this round. So 2 basic situations. I talked about Kaz earlier. You can remove some negative abilities on your own units, which can be kind of fun. I do think Heroism has some better selection of units that you can remove, or abilities that you can remove. Problem is that if you're playing those units and then you can't remove those abilities, are they still playable units? Depends on the situation. And of course, you could use this on your opponent's units, but again, that's like a niche scenario. This is one of those cards where you're kind of playing this bad card to make some other average cards a little bit better. And that's always a bad recipe. To me, this is a D tier. This is a pretty bad one. Next up, we've got Sabine's Masterpiece, which I have had some pretty good experiences with. This is a 3-cost space unit in Heroism. It's a 3/3 Rebel, Vehicle, Spectre, and Fighter. On attack, if you control a Vigilance unit, you get to heal damage from a base. If you control a Command unit, you get to put an experience on a unit. If you control an Aggression unit, you deal 1 damage to a unit or base. Or if you control a Cutting unit, you get to exhaust or ready a resource. If you control multiple different types, you get to do the multiple different abilities. Now, here's the ones that I've found most impactful: Cunning and Command. I've seen situations where you go Battlefield Marine into turn 2 ECL Sabine's Masterpiece, kill your space unit, and still leave Sabine's Masterpiece around. This card can be very impactful, especially with getting that experience token, because you can give the experience token to Sabine's Masterpiece, and then suddenly it's a threat that your opponent kind of is forced to deal with. The exhausting a resource, also very impactful, can completely disrupt your opponent's curve, or readying up your own resource can generate a little bit of extra value. I think actually it's like an A tier card. I don't think it's like insane or anything like that. I think in specific decks, it can be a little bit of value. It's a Rebel that does synergize with a lot of those Rebel synergies, of course. It's a card that it's actually raising up on my list. And I actually think it's somewhere around like the middle to like lower end of A tier. Maybe it's a little bit better than even that, but I've actually had some pretty impressive situations happen to me and happen with it to my opponent for Sabine's Masterpiece to end up in A tier. Next up, we've got Death Star Plans. This one's an interesting one. It's a 2-cost upgrade. It gives no stats. All it says is when attached unit is attacked, the attacking player gets to take this upgrade and attach it to a unit that they control. And then it says attached unit gains. The first unit you play each round costs 2 less. So the idea behind this is you play Death Star Plans, you can play whatever unit you were going to play that turn for the same cost. Okay? And then hopefully you can leverage this enough before your opponent can take control of it to where you can really do some nasty stuff. I don't know about this card. Honestly, out of any card on this list, this is the hardest one for me to evaluate. It is a mechanic that is shifting back and forth. It is a mechanic that potentially you can exploit, but I'm not sure how you would do so. Again, one of the things that one of my patrons mentioned is like trying to play it in a Piet deck, and you stack this with a capital ship discount, and now you get 4 resource discount on your capital ships. you can start playing Devastator, set 1 Devastator for 6 resources, which is kind of cool. But I just haven't really seen a place for this. If this was like, I don't know tier, like I really honestly couldn't say, I would put it in that. I mean, it could do some powerful stuff. I've played around with it a little bit. I just don't know like what I should be looking for with this one. I'd love to see someone build around this. Like every other card, I think has a little bit of theme to it, has kind of an expected outcome for the most part. Some areas where it's good, some areas where it's bad. Obviously, if your opponent can go ahead and just attack your unit, kill it, and you can't get this back, it's horrible for you. And then, of course, in situations where your opponent doesn't play a lot of units, maybe this is good for you because now you get a discount every single turn. I don't know. I'm going to put it in like B tier because I think it's got really varying success rates, and I haven't seen a deck that consistently gets the high end. So, going to be a B tier for me. With all that said, that is the complete set 4 rare and legendary tier list. I think it shaped up pretty reasonable. Just looking back, like normally I go through this and see if there's anything I would probably change. I'm sure there's going to be arguments in the comment section that I hadn't thought of about certain cards, and I'm like, yeah, you know, you're right, probably a little bit higher. I will say the ones in S tier are the ones that are standout for me, particularly Commandeer. I spent a lot of time talking about it. This is a card where when we first saw it spoiled, I was like, that can be pretty nice. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of vehicles that this is an absolute staple. It is better than I thought. A lot of the decks that are playing Change of Heart, or even maybe considered it, are just guaranteed to play like 2 or 3 of Commandeer. I've been playing like 1 or 2 of in my decks, and honestly, I just think you should be playing 3 of them. Like, the card is insane. If your opponent's playing any vehicles whatsoever, this can be a disgusting card. A disgusting card. So definitely give that one a shot if you haven't already. Obviously, they hate that ship. Really solid, especially with that home one. But of course, does expand upon that. Outside of just the home one, Han Solo, great with Millennium Falcon, as it's in the same aspect combination. Devastator, nice finisher, especially with like Django, for example. Ahsoka, good disruptive element. Who knew playing some disruptive elements in the aspect combination of Han Solo would be good? I think we did. Thanks so much, everyone. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. That was a lot of things to go through, but hopefully you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all for a video.